Hey everyone, I'm Bryan, and today I'm going to show you how I made a diorama inspired by an art installation in northern Utah called the Spiral Jetty. I usually make small modular terrain pieces, but this time I wanted to make something bigger. I started with a wood panel that I had painted gray and applied a coat of Mod Podge to the surface. I used this panel in a previous video and I decided to repurpose it for this project. It took a while to coat the board with the Mod Podge, so I'll talk a little bit about what the Spiral Jetty is and why I used it as inspiration for my project. Earlier this year, I was on a road trip and one of the places I passed through was northern Utah, specifically the Salt Lake City region. I wasn't going to be in the area for very long, so while looking up things to do and places to see, I happened to spot the Spiral Jetty on my map. This is a landscape art installation located along the northeastern shore of the Great Salt Lake, about an hour and a half's drive northwest of Salt Lake City. The Spiral Jetty was created in 1970 by American artist Robert Smithson, and the installation features about 6,500 tons of basalt rocks placed in a spiral formation. It starts with a 400-foot line protruding west from the nearby hill, and then curves into a counterclockwise spiral that is about 200 feet in diameter. Due to the changing water levels of the Great Salt Lake, the Spiral Jetty can be exposed and dry, like during the time I visited the area, or it can be partially submerged in water. I thought it was interesting to see, but it only took about 5 minutes to walk along the entire installation, so I kept going and explored the nearby salt flats afterwards. I had never been to this part of Utah before, so the unique features of the landscape and the Spiral Jetty gave me the idea to make something based on what I was seeing on my trip. I'm not going to turn this video into an art history lesson, so if you're interested in learning more about the Spiral Jetty, you can look it up, and any additional details I share about it and the surrounding area will only pertain to my project. So this is my plan for my diorama. I'm going to have part of the shoreline for the lake, and then this part over here is the lake, and then my rendition of the Spiral Jetty right here, sort of in the center left. I'm planning on making the shoreline in 3 different levels, or at least 2 different levels. I'm going to have XPS foam. I'm going to carve that and glue it down to the board. And then, well, at the time I visited the art installation, there wasn't any water around the jetty, but I think for my version, I am going to make some kind of water feature. I'm not sure if it's going to be made from clear glue that's tinted with food coloring, or if it's going to be resin, or what exactly, I don't know. These little mountain things all over here, these are going to represent crystals, because as I was walking out on the salt flats, I saw lots of really interesting crystal formations, so I want to try and incorporate that somehow. And then the spiral itself just going to be a bunch of rocks I'm going to glue on here. And then I think I'm going to put something right in the middle. I'm not really sure yet. The actual jetty doesn't have anything in the middle, but I think it looks kind of plain, so I might make like a little monument or something to go in there. And then this is going to be like the parking lot area, so I have some miniature cars and miniature people that I want to put up here, and then sort of overlooking the jetty. And this is my plan for the project, and I'm hoping it's going to work out, but we will see. As you probably noticed from this video's thumbnail image, my project looks a little bit different from the plan I just explained. I encountered some challenges along the way and ended up making changes at almost every step, so the final result was not what I was expecting when I started my project. This happens a lot when I work on projects, which is why I usually start with a basic idea and then improvise as I go along. However, this project has a lot of parts which needed to be completed in a specific order, so at least I tried to make a plan and stay organized for once. One of my favorite quotes comes to mind whenever I make a plan for my crafting projects.
There are only 4 rules you need to remember. Make the plan, execute the plan, expect the plan to go off the rails, throw away the plan.
To make sure I had the correct shape for the raised landscape side of the diorama, I cut out that section from the sketch I made earlier. At this stage, I was still following my plan, but it wouldn't be long before I started making changes. I had some leftover pieces of blue XPS foam, but they were slightly too short to cover the board. I thought about gluing a couple of pieces to the board and then cutting off the excess, but I didn't want to make a mess, so I decided to attach some smaller pieces to the side that was too short. I don't remember what I used the foam for, but I apparently cut a bunch of smaller pieces and saved them in a bag. I picked out a few of the largest individual pieces and tried to figure out the best position so that they would fit with the larger foam piece. The plan was to carve and shape the foam so that the height of the pieces would gradually get shorter following the trail I mapped out. The arrows on my sketch showed where the hypothetical trail would be to walk from the parking area and down to the edge of the lake. I put the cut piece of my sketch over the big foam piece and traced the outline with a pencil. I used a box cutter to carve away the portion of the big foam piece that I didn't need. I wasn't worried about being precise with the cutting because the foam would eventually be covered up and all I needed was the rough shape. This part wasn't filmed, but I went outside to glue the foam pieces to the board. I used hot glue, and it's not a good idea to breathe in the fumes from melting foam, which is why I went outside. I was also wearing my respirator mask as an added safety precaution. Fumes from melting foam could be hazardous to your health, so please be careful if you try to do something like this on your own. I cut off the outer edge of the sketch to leave the second and third levels of the terrain outline. This would mark where the elevation would change after the first level. I traced the outline from this piece onto the foam, and after that I cut off the next piece for the final level. After making one last tracing, I was ready to begin carving away the foam to actually make the elevation differences. I began cutting away foam from the edge just like I did when I cut the big piece. I cut from the top down and then from the side so that I could loosen the foam enough to rip off a big chunk. I didn't want to carve too deep for a risk of taking off too much foam all at once. Again, I wasn't being precise with this part because the foam will be covered up later, and I'll explain when I get to that step. I was being careful when carving around the smaller foam pieces because I didn't use enough hot glue and the pieces were somewhat loose. After the first level was carved, I moved on to the second level and repeated the carving and tearing process. Usually when I use a ball of foil on XPS foam, it's to texture the surface before painting it. This is a common technique in crafting where the foam retains the imprint of the crumpled foil ball, which creates a rough and uneven surface that is visible even after paint has been applied. It wasn't necessary for this project because I planned on covering all the foam with my texture paste to make the terrain features. My thought was that the texture paste would stick to the foam better if it was roughed up a little bit because the smooth surface of untouched foam may cause adhesion issues. Before I added the texture paste, I needed to make sure the foam pieces were secure. I mentioned earlier that the small foam pieces were coming loose, so I used some PVA glue to try and hold them together. I didn't need a lot of glue because the entire foam surface would be covered with the texture paste and seal everything in. I had a concern that adding the paste before securing the foam might cause the foam to shift out of position as the paste dried. The big piece of foam was wiggling a little bit as well, so I added a line of glue across the edge and that took care of it. I left the project to dry for a few hours to make sure the glue had set before moving on to the next step. My texture paste, or texture mix, is a combination of water, PVA glue, baking soda, and acrylic paint. I don't have an exact ratio for the formula, and it usually comes out a little bit different for each project I am working on. If I need the mix to be thinner or more fluid, I would add more water or paint. If I need it to be thicker or have more texture when it dries, I add more baking soda. If I need it to be stickier so it holds on to whatever I'm applying it to, I would add more glue. The paint alters the color of the mix and it typically stays that color when it dries, but sometimes it turns a slightly lighter shade. If I want the mix to have more grit, sometimes I add in sand or ballast from model railroad scenery. For this project, I needed my mix to have two different consistencies. The first batch was used to cover the exposed part of the wood board, and I chose a yellowish brown color to look like the sandy surface of the Great Salt Lake, but I think my mix was a little too dark in comparison. I realized that I didn't say why I coated the board with Mod Podge at the start of the video, and the Mod Podge is necessary to help prevent the moisture in the texture mix from soaking into the wood. There is a possibility that the wood would warp from the wet ingredients in the texture mix, and using a large amount would increase the chances of this happening. This usually isn't an issue with my smaller projects, but on a larger project like this, I didn't want to take any chances. Spreading the mix over the board was very messy and took a long time, but when I was done, I used a little bit of the mix to fill in the gaps between the foam pieces. This wasn't necessary, and I don't know why I did this because the next batch of texture paste would cover this up as well. I placed some small rocks along the edge of the foam to act as a sort of barrier for when I added the PVA glue to make the water feature. At this point, I had chosen to use glue instead of UV resin because I didn't have enough resin to cover the board. If I poured the glue over the texture mix and it made contact with the foam, I wasn't sure if the glue would pull away from the foam as it dried. The nice thing about PVA glue is that it's easy to use and apply, but it shrinks down to practically nothing when it fully dries. I would need several layers of glue to achieve the effect I wanted, but I'll get to that soon. At least the glue making contact with the rocks would look like the ebb and flow of the tide if the glue shrank too much and pulled away from the rocks. Or that's what I thought would happen, as I didn't know for sure. My original plan was to make the spiral of rocks look like the formation of the Spiral Jetty, but I changed my mind and decided that I wanted my shape to be a clockwise spiral instead. Since the slope of the foam pieces was decreasing from top to bottom, it made more sense to start the line of rocks at the bottom instead of at the top. I also decided to abandon the switchback route from my sketch and just have a sloped hill for my terrain feature. Do you see what I mean when I said I normally make things up as I go? I poured sand over the texture mix to give it a little bit of surface texture when it dried. I made sure to cover the entire surface because I wanted sand everywhere. If I went too light, I could end up with patches of little to no sand, and that wouldn't look good. The sand I'm using is the type that you could use in an aquarium, and I don't remember where I got it, but I've had it for at least a few years. Fortunately, the color of the sand was close to the color of the texture mix, so they didn't clash with each other. After applying the sand, I left the project to dry for a couple of days to ensure the texture mix was completely dry. The second batch of texture mix needed to be thicker and a different color. I used a light tan paint in the mix, and I used more baking soda this time. This mix was intended to be the surface of the hillside, which is drier and rougher than the landscape of the lake. The process of mixing and applying the mix was the same as the last batch, but this time I needed to cover the sides of the hill in addition to the top. Unfortunately, I noticed that the mix was sliding down the foam instead of sticking to it, which meant I didn't use enough glue or I used too much water. The only way to fix it was to scrape it off and start over. I remade the mix with a little bit more glue and a lot more baking soda, and it seemed to work this time. The mix was sticking to the foam, but covering the surface again took a while, so let's skip ahead to after I was done with it, so you don't have to see me do this again. I didn't record this part, but I sprinkled sand over the texture mix again, and then left the project to dry for a couple more days. When the project was dry, I shook off the excess sand and then gently brushed off any remaining particles. I didn't want any loose bits left over for the next part. The terrain flocking I was planning on using was a combination of different grassy textures and colors, some model railroad ballast, and a few bits of dried texture paste. I also wanted to try adding some bigger rocks over the hillside for some extra texture, as if it didn't have enough already. I bought this bag of dark brown rock flocking at my local craft store, and I should have known that the color wasn't going to work with the sandy color of my texture mix. The rocks were way too dark and they stood out too much, but I wasn't thinking about that at the time, so I went ahead and put PVA glue in the places where I wanted the flocking to stick. I sprinkled my combo mix on the lower levels and then added the rocks to the top level. As you can see, I didn't like this at all, so I scraped off the rocks and just used the combo flocking mix instead. Then I had another idea. What if I used the little rocks as filler to go between the big rocks along the edge of the hill? I don't remember why I was so determined to use these rocks, but I added more glue and sprinkled them on anyway. After the rocks were placed, I added some dark green clumpy flocking to further obscure any gaps. It's a little hard to see as I wasn't zoomed in while working on this part. I was being strategic in the placement because foliage grows more when there's water nearby, so the hillside would not have as much foliage compared to the edge of the lake because it's drier. That being said, I added a few more patches of glue on the hillside and sprinkled on some more grassy flocking. Everything looked good at this stage, so I left the project to dry overnight to make sure the glue was set. When the glue had dried, I shook off the excess flocking and then mixed a batch of water and PVA glue together. I used an eyedropper to drip the glue mixture over the larger flocking clumps and then the rest of the hillside. This process locks in the flocking so that it hopefully won't come off when shaken again or when something scrapes against it. Using isopropyl alcohol over the surface first helps spread the watery glue better so it doesn't bead up and drip like what you're seeing here, but I didn't have any at the time, so I just used the eyedropper. With the texture, paste, and terrain flocking set in place, it was finally time to add the water feature. I mixed a tiny bit of blue food coloring into clear PVA glue to make my water. I'm mixing it in the cap of a water bottle because I ran out of disposable cups. Before committing to pouring the glue over the entire surface, I started by adding some around the edges of the board. I wanted to make sure the color looked right and that the glue wouldn't flow over the edges of the board. This was a tedious process, so I'll just skip ahead to when I was done. The glue looked okay, so I prepared to add the rest over the board, but I would soon realize that it wasn't going to turn out how I expected. Okay, this part took over half an hour to finish because I was being really careful not to get glue on the top of the rocks or too much on the edge of the hillside. I'll speed things up into a montage so I can take a break from talking. I apologize if the project isn't in frame in some parts because I was focusing on applying the glue over where the camera was pointing. I left the project to dry for another day to make sure the glue layer was completely dry, and that's when I noticed the slight color difference between the line of glue I spread earlier and the rest of the pour. It doesn't appear as noticeable on camera, but it really stands out in person and it bothered me a lot. I couldn't change it, so the only thing I could do was pour more glue in a darker color over the entire surface and hope it was dark enough to cover the blue layer. I chose purple for this layer because I've seen pictures of the Spiral Jetty with pinkish purple water around it. Apparently, the distinct color comes from microorganisms in the water that produce a pigment which helps protect themselves from the intense sunlight. I didn't have enough glue, so I had to mix another batch, but I used too much purple food coloring, so it ended up being much darker than the previous batch. It wasn't a problem because I just swirled the glue in between the spiral of rocks to make it look like the purple water was flowing with the direction of the spiral. I know that's not how physics works, but whatever, this is just an arts and crafts project. For some reason, my camera switched from video mode to camera mode, so I have a couple of still images of the glue in place. Remember the crystals I mentioned when I was going over my plan? I bought a 1-pound bag of crushed mosaic glass and started separating the colors. I used the pink glass for my crystals and sprinkled them over the glue. Normally, the salt crystals in the Great Salt Lake wouldn't be visible while underwater, but since I visited when there was no water, I saw a lot of interesting formations. I was tempted to pick some up and take them home, but you're not supposed to do that, so I took as many pictures as I could instead. When I was done with the crystals, I left the project to dry for another day. You know the drill by now. I wanted to make sure the glue was completely dry before moving on to the next step. I didn't leave enough space in the center of my rock spiral for a monument like I planned, so instead, I created a little model to put on the hillside. This model is an ammonite fused with a crystal formation. I didn't create the models for these pieces, but I did combine them in my 3D printing software. I'll put links in the description to where I found the models. The rock spiral sort of looks like the shape of an ammonite shell, so that's why I chose this creature, and the abundance of salt crystals seemed like a good secondary feature. Ammonites did live in the region that would eventually become the Great Salt Lake, but they lived during the Mesozoic era when the region was covered by an ocean millions of years ago. I painted the combined models with my 3D printer, and I used translucent filament with the intention of painting the surface with food coloring so that the models would stay semi-transparent, but I forgot and ended up using regular acrylic paint. I painted the model with a base coat of purple, and while it was drying, I cut a small piece of leftover XPS foam to use as the pedestal. I painted it gray, and once that dried, I glued it to the model. After this, I really don't know what I was doing because I took a cotton swab and used it to paint red food coloring over the model's surface. I don't know what effect I was going for, but it didn't look good. Next, I tried dry brushing some gray paint over the food coloring, but mixing the two materials caused the gray to turn into a light pink color. I was somewhat okay with this because it highlighted the details of the model. When the model was dry, I finished the piece by dry brushing some darker gray colors on the pedestal to make the details stand out. Although it's a really small piece, so you can't really see the details unless you get a very close look. I used tacky glue to attach the model and pedestal to the skinny part of the hillside, but it wasn't level, so I tried using some of the small rock flocking as filler to balance it out. I bought some miniature people figures from my local craft store with the intention of placing them on the diorama to show scale. I also bought an assortment of toy cars, but I knew the cars wouldn't be an exact match to the scale of the people, so I ended up picking the blue Toyota RAV4 to use in the diorama. I didn't like the sickly yellow color of the skin tone for the people, so I repainted it to look more like natural skin. I'm going to skip through this part because it was really hard for me to focus on the painting and keep the people in frame when they are so small. After painting the skin tones, I added a few extra details like recoloring parts of the clothing and fixing a few spots that had been overpainted during the manufacturing process. Okay, for some reason I took a close-up picture of the ammonite statue next, so here it is, all finished and attached to the hillside. We're reaching the end of the project, so the next to last step was to paint the sides of the board and the foam black. I cleaned off any glue and texture paste so that the sides were clean and ready for painting. This part took about 20 minutes to complete, so I'll speed things up into another montage. The final step for the project was to glue the people to the diorama. I was being careful where I placed the people because once the super glue makes contact, I wouldn't be able to move them easily. Since the mother figure is in a sitting position, I placed her on a rock at the edge of the spiral. The child looks like they have a curious nature, so I put them at the center of the spiral looking down at the formation they just walked across. The father figure is waiting at the top of the hill by the car, perhaps looking out at the scenery or perhaps impatiently waiting for his family to finish so they can move on to something else. Once the people were in place, my diorama project was complete. All that was left was to show off the final result. Thanks for watching my video. This isn't the longest video I've made for my channel, but it sure felt like it. I ended up cutting out over half of the recorded footage, and that's not including all the clips I sped up throughout the video. I took a break from making projects at the end of April because I had been uploading a new video every week for an entire year, and I was burned out. I needed some time to relax, but I couldn't stay away from the crafting projects for long because I started planning this project a couple of weeks later. Over the next month, I worked on this project a little bit at a time, every few days, and I finished the recordings about 2 weeks ago, but I encountered some problems with my editing software. For some reason, the program I had been using just stopped working and I couldn't fix it even after seeking help, so I had to get a completely different program and learn how to use it from scratch. This process took a very long time, and while I didn't utilize a lot of fancy features, I stayed close to what I used to do in the other program. What would have taken a few hours of editing ended up taking over a week because I had to learn the new program and how to do everything. But now that I'm somewhat familiar with the basics, I'm sure the editing process will be a lot easier. I'm still uncertain about how often I will post videos, but I appreciate you watching this one, especially if you made it all the way to the end. Have a nice day and stay tuned for more projects in the future.